national city at that time. Its population was rapidly growing. It was 89,000 in 1900. It was 150,000 by 1910. It was 200,000 by 1920. So rapidly growing, rapidly changing urban environment, and along with change came sort of apprehension about change, or fear about change, resistance to change. The city looked physically different, of course, than the small towns and rural areas where most new immigrants to the city had come from. For instance, there were skyscrapers that were 10, 15, 18 stories high. He was one of the architects of the so-called New South, a South, among other things, that would combine industry as well as agriculture to kind of remove the South from its poverty after the Civil War. So he was one of the people who the Atlanta Constitution sponsored this exposition in 1881 to bring industry to the South and increase interest in the textile industry. He was one of the people who helped bring Georgia Tech come here in the mid-1880s as the state's technological school to kind of rival what would become MIT in Boston. So the New South was this combination of industry and agriculture, but another part of the New South was this idea of reconciliation between the different sections of the country, between the North and the South. And in Atlanta, of course, people were very interested in getting Yankee dollars to invest in Atlanta. And the kind of part of this idea of sectional reconciliation was that the South should yield, or the North should yield to the South in terms of race relations, because the South understood race relations better than the North did. The problem is, by the time we're talking about, the South had yielded to extremists on race. You really have what is really the low point in American race relations, and you do have extremists kind of running the people calling for leaf lynching, people calling for Jim Crow, sort of racial radicals, if you will, extremists. We don't know what Grady would have done concerning the riot. We know a lot about what he said during his time, but he died in 1889. Right after he died, they began the construction of Grady Hospital and this monument as well. So those were the two things named right after his death for Henry Grady. Really important legal decisions. It's now called the Elbert Tuttle Federal Courthouse. Elbert Tuttle was the lead judge of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals during the Civil Rights era. The Montgomery bus boycott case, the University of Georgia desegregation case were heard in this building. Elbert Tuttle is an interesting guy. He was born in the 1890s in Hawaii. He went to the same school that President Obama went to in Hawaii, his multiracial school. After World War I, came to Atlanta to practice law, and immediately got involved in a number of civic concerns. He eventually was on the board of Atlanta University and Spelman College. He joined the National Guard and committed a personal act of bravery by literally saving a man who was on the verge of being lynched by throwing a tear gas canister into the mob and rescuing the man, and eventually taking his case all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court. He was appointed by President Eisenhower to the federal bench in 1954. He also was a Republican at the time, and in 1952 he led a biracial delegation to the Republican National Convention with a man named John Wesley Dobbs. Walter White had blonde hair, blue eyes, and fair complexion, yet was designated black. Very pale skinned. Walter White and his father went up to the post office where you saw that Saturday night, kind of to check in, aware of the ruckus going on near 5 Points, decided to go this way rather than that way back home. Back home was on the block near where the Georgia State dorms are, near Piedmont, between Piedmont and Portland, on one of those blocks over there on Ellis Street. But they came this way, and Walter White wrote later that they picked up a middle-aged woman in their buggy and who was fleeing the mob and carried her to safety. He also talked about a day or two later in their neighborhood, members of the mob came looking for his father, and at least their neighbors, if not the Whites themselves, fired back. Self-defense. Or in that part of town. Walter White tells us, too, that African Americans did fight back, did engage in self-defense, defending their families, their homes, and their communities. I mentioned the armed men who were awaiting the streetcar men of black youth and their youth leader, Luther Price, in South Atlanta. And on Sunday evening, after the Saturday night disturbance downtown, a group of Fulton County police officers went to South Atlanta because they had heard rumors, probably accurate, that African Americans were in fact arming themselves in self-defense. And in South Atlanta that night, at dusk, there was a shootout, and about half a dozen people lay dead at the end. I'll mention 2 of them. One was the oldest victim of the riot that we know of, a man named George Wilder. Turns out that most of the victims were probably young men themselves in their late teens and early 20s. They were shoeshine boys and messenger boys, and working as barbers. Most of the victims tended to be young men. There were some women who were victims. This was George. White. One of those streets is Auburn Avenue, where Martin Luther King was born. Martin Luther King's grandfather, the Reverend A.D. Williams, who pastored the Ebenezer Church, as did King and his father, bought that house from white people who were living in that neighborhood and left in the aftermath of the race riots. So more residential segregation after the riot, more business segregation. Prior to the riot, as I was telling somebody on the tour, black-owned businesses on Auburn Avenue extended all the way west to Peachtree Street and served a mixed-race clientele. In the aftermath of the riot, they moved a couple blocks to the east along Auburn Avenue and served essentially an all-black clientele for the next 50 years or more. And Auburn Avenue became the hub of black business and social life and one of the main black main streets in the United States. The riot definitely figured into, at the state level, the Disfranchisement Act, and it was called the Disfranchisement Act, being passed the next year. And by 1910, the number of eligible black voters had dropped from 28% in 1904 to 4% were still on the voting rolls by 1910. So it has that impact. And the fears around the riot definitely played into that. White man, a man named Oswald Garrison Villard, who's the grandson of William Lloyd Garrison, the abolitionist, who makes the first call for a nationwide civil rights organization. So you can kind of connect the dots between Atlanta in 1906 and the NAACP in 1909. It took another white riot in Springfield, Illinois, the home of Lincoln, in 1908 to directly lead to the establishment of the NAACP, but you can certainly draw the connections between Atlanta and the founding of the NAACP. The last thing I want to talk about is memory. We talked about, for some people in the black community, the riot was a wake-up call, a call to action, a galvanizing moment, people like Lizzie McDuffie or Walter White. For others in the black community, it's a cautionary story. Remember what happened in 1906, let's not rock the boat. So in the late 70s, we interviewed a man who was a barber in the 30s on Auburn Avenue, had been a young boy at the time of the riot, and he recalled a time in the 1930s when the Ku Klux Klan marched up Auburn Avenue. He flashed back to 1906. He closed up his shop because he was afraid that the Klan would tear up Auburn Avenue, with 1906 very much in his mind. So the cautionary tale, don't rock the boat, you remember what happened in 1906. In the white community, in the mainstream memory, in the official memory, the riot was very quickly minimized, swept under the rug, neglected, whatever word you want to kind of talk about. There's an official report, December of 1906, Fulton County official report on the race riot. They claimed the total number of people who died in the riot was 12. 10 black, Officer Hearn, and the woman who died of a heart attack. And they said a report of any greater number is greatly exaggerated. If you read the Atlanta Constitution on that night alone, you get up to about 16 or 17 on just a Saturday night. We work very, very